Today we're going to get this old car running again. Now, what kind of car is this? Well, it's a 1969 Renault R10. I reckon the correct way to say it is Renault or something like that. I don't think it really matters with this audience because from some of the older comments that I've read, folks are calling this vintage French car everything from a Peugeot to a Fiat. Nope, it's a Renault, and as we say in America, Renault. So older French cars are notorious for being weird, and well, this car wasn't weird enough, so we helped it out a little bit, and last year we swapped in a 670cc Predator V twin. Now in theory, this car did run and drive, but a lot has happened in the last 6 months. So I don't know what the deal is with this car, and I'm gonna need your help. Let's see, is there anybody actually watching right now? Oh, there's a few people. All right, you with the red shirt. Yeah, you. Okay, blue shirt guy, sit down. I'm pointing at the red shirt person. What's your name? Okay, Mike, go ahead and look at our video catalog for this channel and tell me what was the last thing we did to this car. Uh-oh, Mike just ran away. I guess the pressure was too much for him. So, I don't know. We'll figure this out, but first we have to get the car running again. Well, I'm not sure why, but the stock carburetor is back on the engine. As I recall, we were playing around with various Key and CVK carburetors last season, and for whatever reason, this stock 2-barrel carburetor is back. Meh. The larger Key and single-throat carbs certainly improved performance, but they were difficult to tune. I think for today, we'll leave the stock carburetor right where it's at. Now, one of the things I do recall is I was in the process of moving the alternator to this side of the engine, and it looks like some fabrication has already been done, as there appears to be a pulley attached to the flywheel. Let's see if we can get a better look. I reckon we should pull this cover off. Oh, lots of loose parts. Fan belt, well, we'll get back to that later. It looks like the flywheel pulley thingy is also loosely attached. You know, I do remember making this stuff, I just don't remember how far I got. Okay, let's get the cover off. Well, okay, that's looking a lot better. Of course, the cooling fan is not present, and we will be putting that back in place. So this is a homemade drive system that I built so I could mount a pulley on this side of the engine. Now, I did make this stuff with scraps of 6061 aluminum for practically zero money, but an actual pulley hub is available for these 670cc engines. Actually, an entire 40-amp alternator kit is available from Performance 670. I decided to make my own because I wanted to use the smaller 20-amp alternator. And I like to make stuff. Anyway, this car isn't driven at night or in the rain, so it only needs enough juice to keep the battery charged, and a cheapo 20-amp alternator is plenty. We'll take a closer look at this drive system later. I think right now the task at hand is to actually mount an alternator so we can finish this project and get the car running again. The alternator that we're using is very simple, and it's not the best when it comes to generating power. You see, at low engine RPMs, this guy doesn't generate much, if any, power, and that's perfect. Let me explain. When the Predator engine is idling, this alternator doesn't put much of a load on the engine, and that allows us to set the idle speed as low as it'll go. Now on this engine, if the idle speed drops below 900 RPM, well, the compression relief mechanism kicks in and the engine will stall. So the fact that this alternator basically sucks at low speed is perfect, and that's because it doesn't affect the idle speed of the engine. And on this rig, we need the idle speed to be as low as possible. You see, a low idle speed allows the clutch that we're using to work properly. There's a very, very, very fine line where the clutch will release completely and allow us to slip the transmission into gear and the engine stalling from the compression relief mechanism kicking in. Now, if we installed something like a Denso Mini 40-amp alternator, like we're using on the supercharged Kubota diesel Honda, well, that's actually a really good alternator, and it will put out a decent charge at low RPM, but the drawback is it also puts a load on the engine. Now, on the diesel car, it doesn't matter, but on the Predator, it would cause problems because we would have to increase the idle speed in order to use this alternator. The bottom line is, this alternator will put out a solid 20 amps when the Renault's at cruising speed, and that's all that really matters, especially since this silly French car is only driven in perfect weather. Fast forward a bit, and I put the engine cooling shroud back on so we can figure out where to mount the alternator. And somewhere around here looks good. Of course, there's no solid material in this area and we'll have to build some brackets. Now, something to keep in mind, we do have a set of dual carburetors for this engine that I'm very anxious to try out, so we need to leave enough space for them. You see, the twin carb kit uses different intake manifolds, and the manifolds actually pass through the engine cooling shroud. Even though it looks like we have a lot of space, well, we really don't. Anyway, it looks like we have a solid mounting point on the engine cradle, and we can use that to anchor the alternator with a custom bracket or two. Let me take a few measurements, and we can start building something. For this application, the alternator mounting bracket needs to be as strong and as stiff as possible because we're only going to be using 2 bolts to hold it to the engine cradle. I reckon this 3/16 thick steel angle should be strong enough, but if it's not, oh well. I like to use Sharpies to mark my cut lines, but sometimes they're really hard to see, so it helps to shoot a quick coat of contrasting paint before I mark up the steel. I guess any paint will work, but this Rust-Oleum aluminum primer is cheap and it dries quick. I have no idea if this stuff's any good for priming aluminum because I've never used this stuff as it was intended to be used, but it's perfect for making a contrast so I can see my cut lines. You know, about 15 years ago, I cut the tip of one of my fingers off with an angle grinder, right through the fingernail and through the bone. Now, unfortunately, that's not the first time I cut a finger off, and some would say I'm somewhat of an expert at it. Anyway, as it turns out, a few well-placed stitches at the hospital will pretty much fix all kinds of stuff. Now, despite a lot of mistakes I made in the past, I'm happy to report I still have all my fingers, except 2 of them have been slightly modified. Of course, today's goal is to get the Renault running and driving again, but as a secondary goal, I'm trying not to get any more scars. So I'm wearing my Kevlar, because this Renault has a lot of sharp edges on it, and I reckon if anybody ever looked real close at that car, you would see a few bloodstains. Fast forward a bit and the alternator bracket is finished. Unfortunately, I had to do most of this stuff off camera to save time. Not too shabby. And it also looks like we're going to have plenty of space to do the twin carburetor conversion. But that's a project for another day. Let's take a better look at this stuff on the bench. So this is all the stuff I built in order to install the 20 amp alternator. Like I mentioned earlier, all this metal was sourced from the scrap bin. This, of course, is the actual alternator bracket. This bracket bolts to the right side of the engine cradle via these 2 bolt holes. Now, this isn't the best method to secure the bracket, but it was the easiest. Anyway, since this bracket can see a lot of stress, I actually did my best to make sure the welds were good enough. Now, this is actually a Predator part, and I based all my measurements from this part so I could maintain center and not have issues with stuff wobbling around. I did cheat a little bit, and I 3D printed a template so I could accurately transfer the hole locations onto this aluminum hub I made. So yeah, this template worked perfect. I find that designing these templates on a computer has really improved the quality of the junk I make. Now this guy over here is sort of a shaft extension, and it keys into the hub with this roll pin. The roll pin is to prevent any slippage between the parts when this is all bolted together. Now I speculate that there isn't going to be a lot of torque on any of these rotating parts, but I went ahead and pinned them for good measure. And finally, this is one of the 3 standoff extensions. When I machined the 3 extensions, I double-checked the weight of each one of these, and they're almost exactly the same as far as weight goes. So that'll help maintain balance when the engine's running. Now, given the fitment tolerances of all the parts, this completed assembly should be fine as far as balance goes. Well, enough talk, let's put this together and see if it'll work. As you can see, I'm wearing my Kevlar sleeves so I can avoid cuts and bruises. These sleeves are generic and they're available from all the places you can get cheap stuff from, if you know what I mean. I've had these sleeves for about a year now, and I've only recently started wearing them, and they do work. As I get older, I seem to get injured a lot more easily, and that stuff shows up on camera quite often. Anyway, with these sleeves, you become sort of like a mechanic superhero, and you can easily dodge cuts and bruises while fighting the engineering disasters both foreign and domestic. Even this simple little French car that's 5 decades old, well, it has sinister underpinnings that'll snag a hole in your epidermis if you're not careful. The battle is real, and it's only going to get worse as time goes on. Be all you can be with a set of Kevlar sleeves, or just buy a bunch of Band-Aids. Either one will work fine. Well, it looks like we jammed enough screws back into this contraption and it's probably safe to try starting the engine. I'm a bit concerned about this fuel hose. You see, it's not very old, but it's become brittle and it's likely going to fail soon. I say for today, we take a chance and leave it alone. Let's check the gas. Looks like there's enough to get the engine running and it smells okay. The choke cable has been disconnected and I'll have to manually choke the carburetor. Let's turn the ignition on and see if the battery still has juice. Wow, it's been a long time since I sat in this car. Okay, so we're in neutral, that's good. Now for these switches. This is the main disconnect and I know this needs to be on. Okay, the fuel pump's working. I actually forgot this car had a fuel pump. Looks like the battery's a bit low. Hopefully it'll be enough. I believe this is the kill switch for the engine. Keep in mind, this engine has magneto ignition, and in order to shut the engine off, the magnetos have to be grounded. Okay, so this last switch is for something, and I'm not sure it's actually connected to anything. Maybe we should leave it off for now. Let's see if we have any fuel leaks. I guess we should have checked that right away. Yeah, everything looks fine. I think we're good to go for ignition. Stand by. Since I have to manually choke the carburetor, I'll be using the Lone Wolf 2000 to operate the electric starter. Not bad. Oh, it sounds like the idle's too low. Meh, it'll do this when the engine's cold. So it looks like we got a little bit of a wobble. Yeah, that's good enough. Let's see if the alternator's working. And it's not. I'll bet that last switch controls the alternator. Let's try that out. Yes, that was the trick. So I guess all three switches need to be on. It's amazing what you can forget in 6 months. The engine seems to run pretty good, so there's a good chance the car was drivable before it was parked for the winter. You know, other than working on the alternator, I honestly don't remember what I was doing to this car last time I fooled with it. Now, we have pretty high standards here, so I'm going to let this thing run for about 20 minutes, and if nothing falls off, I believe we're ready to drive it. There's a lot of stuff I still need to do, but that can wait for later. It's been 6 months since I drove this thing. Perhaps we should take the car out for a spin. As I recall, the fuel tank holds 2.5 gallons, and this car can consume all of that in about 80 miles. So we'll try to stay local. The tires on this car haven't been checked in a while. Now, when this car was originally built, the wheels required inner tubes, and that's because the rims are riveted together. I guess it made sense at the time. Well, I modified the rims slightly so I wouldn't have to use inner tubes. Let's see how much air is still left in the tires after 6 months. Not bad. I reckon we haven't lost any air. So the trick I did to convert these rims to tubeless was, I installed tire patches over each rivet in the rim, and I used this stuff to glue the patches in place. Seems to work pretty good. The weather seems okay right now, although there is rain expected later. Let's take this thing out for a ride and have some fun. Okay, turn on the master switch. This is the kill switch for the magnetos. This is the fuel pump. And this guy is what turns the alternator on. So I forgot, reverse doesn't work, and we're going to have to use the Flintstone method to back the car up. So the problem with reverse is an internal problem with the gearbox, and it's not an external shift linkage problem. You see, all the bushings have been replaced in the linkage, however there seems to be something inside the transmission that's preventing the engagement of reverse. Now I did buy a vintage service manual for this car, and it looks like it's possible to gain access to the shift rods by removing a cover on the front of the gearbox. Someday I'll take a look at that, but not today. Yeah, it's looking a bit dusty, but I am digging the sort of barn find look it's sporting. Alright, so we do have a 4-speed transmission, but the way I've set it up is we only need to use 3rd and 4th gear. The CVT clutch works best this way. Whoops, a little bit of gear grinding. The idle must be a little bit too high. I'll need to adjust the idle later so the gearbox works properly. And we're off. Wow, this thing is definitely not sluggish. Off the line, it feels great. So 3rd gear on this buggy will take the car up to 50 or 55 miles per hour if we were drag racing, but realistically the transmission should be shifted into 4th gear at, I forgot, maybe something like 30 or so. I think I'm just going to leave it in 3rd gear because as I recall that's the best gear for in-town driving. So yeah, this car does have a 4-speed manual transmission, but it's driven like it has an automatic gearbox. Now that's not something weird that the French did. Nope, I take full credit for this bizarre transmission setup. The 2-cylinder V-twin engine actually sounds wonderful. And the CVT drive system sort of, well, it ruins the sound a little bit, but I'm okay with that. Now, as I recall, we had a lot of problems with the Comet 44 series torque converter clutch that we initially used, and it really wasn't the clutch's fault. You see, we were asking that clutch to do way too much than what it was designed to do, so we upgraded to a Comet 94 series clutch. This newer clutch has a wider operating range and can handle the power from the V-twin engine. Now this car tips the scale at just over 1,800 pounds, and around town the 22 horsepower engine seems fine as far as power goes. Out on the back roads, well, that's a different story. When we shift into 4th gear, I believe the top speed is something like 65 miles per hour. But it's scary to drive this thing that fast. I reckon this car would benefit from a complete suspension overhaul. Now, if you're new to the channel, there's about a dozen or so videos we made on this car last year, and the videos cover how we built all the parts to do the engine conversion and why we used the CVT type torque converter clutch and not a regular clutch. Oh, by the way, this is just a pointless engine conversion, and what I mean by that is we didn't build this rig to get better fuel economy, and we didn't build it to improve performance of this old Renault. Although, we did do a lot of carburetor tuning, and somehow we got better performance from the V-twin engine. But overall the car is still slower with the 2-cylinder engine than it was with the original 4-cylinder engine. It's just a fun project that we can run experiments on and see what works and what doesn't. Yeah, this car is actually fun to drive. It's the very definition of street legal go-kart. I reckon this is perfect for in-town driving, but it does equally well out on the open road. You know, this car is actually quick enough that I can easily get a speeding ticket in town, so I have to keep an eye on the speedometer. Not many people can say that about their lawnmower-powered cars. Well, when you think about it, I might be the first to actually say that. That should be enough of a test drive to confirm everything works. Let's head back to the shop. Well, it looks like the alternator and the fan belt are still attached to the engine, so that's good. I suppose if there were going to be any problems, well, we'd see them down the road, but so far so good. Now, I went digging through some boxes, and it looks like this was the last carburetor we were testing. I think this is either a 34 or a 36mm Kian CVK carburetor. It's a big one. Now, it also looks like we never got a chance to test this 3D printed manifold adapter. And that's a shame, because it looks interesting. So here's the plan. I think we're going to ditch the Kian CVK carburetors and go with a conventional Mikuni carburetor. The CVK stuff, well, that's interesting, but it's difficult to tune. And I'm not sure if that's the nature of the CVKs or the fact that this is a knockoff carburetor. But before we start fooling around with the Mikuni carburetors, I want to fiddle around with the twin carbs and see what that's all about. Getting the Renault running again was definitely a nice break from the supercharged Kubota diesel project. And the good news is a lot of parts have arrived for the intercooler, so look forward to more supercharged diesel stuff next week. We'll see you next time.